Cities were dangerous places during this time. The congestion, all the people living together, combined with a lack of public services, it created a dangerous environment. Crime, fire, disease, poverty, all would require new responses, new ways of dealing with these issues, because we really had no answer to them in the early days of big American cities. Downtowns would frequently just burn to the ground. Virtually everything was wood. And so one little fire would catch a building on fire, which would catch the next building on fire. And so the whole town would burn down, a whole city. Chicago and Boston, for example, both burned down in major fires in 1871. One response to this is a government response. It's professional fire departments paid for with tax dollars to stop this from happening. But the real long-term response is fireproof buildings, which happens as we begin to transition from wood buildings to steel buildings. Of course, there was an upside to the fires. They were largely bad, property destruction, people died, animals died. But it meant that these cities were constantly being rebuilt with newer and better architecture, which is why there aren't really a lot of structures left in cities from before the days of steel buildings, because they'd simply have burnt down by now. Disease was actually deadly. Oh, I should mention, I have to stop and take a second to talk about the Boston molasses disaster. This was a 19th century event, early 20th century, where a giant building filled with molasses, which is syrup basically, got too hot. And the molasses expanded, and when molasses is hot, it's very watery. It's not sticky and slow. And it flooded through the streets of Boston, killing 11 people and severely injuring 50. This was a danger of living in the city. They didn't really know how to respond to this. So Boston had a tragic molasses flood there. This is one of the early disasters of the city. Disease was actually much deadlier. It often would begin in poor areas, which had the worst sanitation and also the closest living quarters. The people were literally closer together. Nobody really understood how sewage could contaminate a water supply, because we don't really have a germ theory of disease yet, and so we weren't really fighting germs because we didn't know about them. Cholera and typhoid fever are two major causes of death that easily spread through cities. These are communicable diseases. But as we begin to understand that sewage is a problem, human waste is a problem, we develop things like flush toilets, which come from Europe, and sewers, which began to appear in American cities in the 1870s. But raw sewage in major cities is still prevalent and right there in the open in many cities well into the 20th century. So you might have toilets that just pipe their waste right out onto the street. And so you're walking down the street and there's human waste. And of course, not only was that disgusting, but it led to a lot of disease. There is no conception of modern environmentalism, in other words, environmentalism for the sake of health. And the cost was evident in these cities. There was very little idea of making cities a safe place. Human waste and animal waste, remember, until the early 1900s, these cities are all filled with horses because that's how everything gets moved. And then you also have industrial waste from the factories and the like, create just enormous, unthinkable amounts of pollution compared to what we have today. The burning of coal for energy creates a constant fog that hangs over every city, and massive respiratory problems. In fact, asthma was very deadly back in the day, simply because the air was so incredibly dirty, and a lot of people, particularly youngsters, would die of this. By 1900, crusaders had emerged, arguing that we had to clean up the cities and make them safer places. And by 1910, most cities had sewers and a separation between wastewater and drinking water. That's nice, isn't it? And by 1912, we actually have a public health service, a government agency in charge of trying to fix these problems. And it targeted mainly industry-related diseases, so industrial pollution, that sort of thing. Although it has no enforcement power. All it can do is kind of release studies and put public pressure on these companies to clean up. It won't be until 1970, with the creation of the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, where the government will actually have the power to force industries not to make the cities the worst places, that we'll actually begin to see real, true change. Of course, these cities and urbanization bred poverty. And there wasn't a whole lot of help. The government didn't have programs like food stamps or Section 8 housing or something like that to help the poor. There was a small amount of public and private charity. But for the most part, if you were poor, you were just poor. There was no help for you. The middle class, the idea was at the time, when we give these people anything, then we'll encourage them not to work, and we'll create this breed of dependent people who expect us to hand everything to them, and they will be unwilling to work. There was a real notion that the wealthy or even the middle class would be happy to help for deserving poor. Deserving poor meant people who couldn't work. If you were blind, if you had some sort of physical condition that prevented you from working. But if you were a healthy, able-bodied man and you weren't working, they figured you were just lazy. People didn't really seem to understand that there were probably economic factors that led into why you weren't at work all day, meaning you couldn't find a job. There was more effort and more money spent to try to figure out who deserved charity than there was actual charity spent. They wanted to really make sure that you couldn't work. You really had some problem. The Salvation Army was formed in 1879, and they focused on evangelism in the early days. They were trying to get people to find Jesus, not so much trying to say help people eat. In fact, the only reason they began to help people eat is to try to get them to come in and listen to the preachers, try to convert them, or try to get them to embrace a religious lifestyle. There were massive numbers of runaways and orphans, and these would attract a lot of attention. There was a lot of concern about all these poor kids on the street with no one to help them. But the truth is, there was a lot more concern about them than there was actual help provided to them. Poverty, of course, breeds crime. In areas where there's high poverty, there's high crime rate. People have more to gain and less to lose from crime. The murder rate in 1880 was 25 murders per million people. In 1900, as we become more industrialized, it was more than 100 murders, more than 4 times higher per million people. By the way, that also adds in lynching in the American South, which added to the murder rate to a significant extent. This was usually blamed on immigrant gangs and organized crime, although that wasn't true. The murder rate was not going up because of immigrants, of course, but white Americans born in America love to blame problems on immigrants, and that's one of the things they'll do here. But research doesn't seem to show that's true. The response to this, similar to the response to the fire problem, is a professional government solution. Police departments, professional police departments paid for by taxpayers. Of course, the police were paid incredibly poorly, and they weren't very professional at all. In fact, they were often criminal themselves and often involved in things like protection rings where they would take money not to beat you up or arrest you, and were frequently very violent. The fear of urban crime was so great that in the wealthy parts of town, they began to establish urban National Guard fortresses where they would basically hire mercenaries to guard the rich parts of town to keep the poor people out of them. And this is also a time when the poor people and the rich people might live a block away from each other. And so they weren't separated geographically to any real extent. But all that being said, the cities were exciting. They were magnetic. They were where the action was. They were where you wanted to be for most people, particularly younger people. They were also, of course, impersonal and degrading. Unlike the town you came from, you didn't know everybody in the city. It was filled with all these people you didn't know. And they were very difficult places for single women. It was hard, of course, for single women to find decent work. And single women who went to the city very often ended up turning to prostitution to support themselves. The cities just were not a place that was friendly to a single woman trying to make a life for herself. Cities tended to be run by political party machines. What they would do is they would go wait on the docks and try to get immigrants who were coming off the boat from Europe who didn't know anybody here, and the party machine, this is the Democratic or the Republican Party in the city, would say, you just do what we tell you to, and we'll make sure everything's taken care of. And so they may set you up with a job and a place to live and introduce you to other people who come from your community back in Europe, and your sole responsibility was to vote the right way. And this was a time before secret ballots, so they would actually sit there with a checklist and make sure you voted the way you're supposed to vote. And as long as you voted the right way, they would keep making sure that you got taken care of. And this was how, and some machines were Republican and some were Democrat, but virtually every city in the country was run by a machine, and this is how they worked and maintained their power. And so the immigrant communities would be molded into these unbreakable voting blocks to make sure that one side or the other got elected. And of course, bosses would reward particularly hardworking people. What I mean by that is people who really were going out there and making sure the immigrants were doing what they were supposed to do with government jobs. And so this was kind of a giant racket, a giant criminal conspiracy. And of course, the bosses themselves they could run as crooked a government as they want. They could line their own pockets all they wanted to because who was going to stop them? They had this immigrant community that didn't know what was going on, probably didn't even speak English, who would vote for them no matter what they did. And so there was lots of bribes and kickback money and things like this. The most famous example is the Tammany Hall Gang, which is run by this man here, Boss Tweed, in the picture, from the 1860s into the early 1870s. And what would happen is eventually people would get so sick, the non-immigrants would get so sick of all the corruption, that they would organize, find a candidate, run them. They would run all the political machines, candidates out of office But of course, once you reform the government, all the energy disappears, and within an election or two, all the old crooked guys are back there again, and the cycle starts all over again. But a lot of major politicians, including a number of presidents during this time, will make their name by breaking up these city machines, although usually those city machines would return within a few years anyway.